By the close of the 18th century, this new nation was already experiencing growing pains, with most of its population crammed along the eastern seaboard. In 1803, the United States government bought all of the land claimed by France, which encompassed a big chunk of what is now the country's midsection. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country at the time, flinging wide the gates of westward expansion. In the central United States, most of the population gravitated to one of the country's lifelines.
It was concentrated along the Mississippi River or at places where pioneers or the Indians felt it was a good place to live. They would come in seasonally, hunt the area, then go to their towns that were in northeastern Mississippi with the goods that they hunted from this area and settle down for the wintertime. But in terms of permanent settlements in this area, they were very far and few between.
In 1811, the United States of America was only 35 years old. Our fourth president, James Madison, was in office, and just about everything west of the Mississippi River was a vast, unexplored wilderness. Along the mighty Mississippi, there existed only a handful of settlements. In the Missouri Territory, the towns of St. Louis and St. Genevieve, which were founded by French settlers, and the village of New Madrid, which lay on the western bank of the river as it crooked north and back south.
New Madrid had about 200 people in it, give or take, the town itself. The pioneers themselves were a very scattered, disparate group of people in terms of from all nationalities. The French, the Spanish, the Americans, immigrants into the United States, all of them with different cultures, different ways of looking at the frontier, and different ways of dealing with the frontier at the time.
Downriver from these settlements lay the towns of Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans, which was already almost 100 years old. The city of Memphis wasn't even a speck on the map at that point, only a Spanish-built fort on the bluff overlooking the river.
Basically, there was a trading post with the Chickasaws, there was Fort Pickering itself, and a settlement of scattered people along the bluffs because of the advantage of being above the flood level.
Even before this country's history was written by the white man, the natives were well acquainted with the lifeblood that flowed down its rivers.
Of course, the Mississippi River Valley is probably one of the heaviest populated areas in the United States in prehistory, just because of the water and the fish and the game, the trees and everything.
The land was very rich. There were good spots to make settlements and farms. You had the river to haul your goods down the Mississippi. You also, as New Madrid as a stopping point, could sell goods to people coming ashore looking for provisions as they were going down the river. So New Madrid was a good place to live.
As the 19th century dawned, Mississippi River traffic was becoming heavier as swaths of wilderness were swept away by civilization.
So you had canoes, dugout tree stumps, rafts, flatboats, all wooden boats, no steel hulls or anything.
Flatboats were made out of lumber milled along the Ohio River or along the Cumberland River or any of the tributaries. They would be filled with goods for a one-way trip down the river to New Orleans.
For the simple folk who populated the Mississippi River Valley, life on the frontier was quiet, for the most part, uneventful, bucolic. That is, until one dark night that would literally shake the country's middle right down to its foundation.
Funding for this program was made possible in part by the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, failure is not an option, the West Tennessee Seismic Safety Commission, the United States Geological Survey, Science for a Changing World, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
It was early morning on December 16th, witching hour some would call it, about 2 a.m., when the first violent tremor struck close to the New Madrid area, startling those on land.
We were visited by a violent shock of an earthquake, accompanied by a very awful noise resembling loud but distant thunder, but more hoarse and vibrating. which was followed in a few minutes by the complete saturation of the atmosphere with sulfurous vapor, causing total darkness.
And on the water,
we were affrighted with the appearance of a dreadful rapid or falls in the river just below us. We were so far in the suck that it was impossible now to land. All hope of surviving was now lost, and certain destruction appeared to await us.
it was the first salvo in a series of earthquakes that would shake the central and eastern U.S. for the next 6 months.
In the night, I was awakened by a most tremendous noise, accompanied by an agitation of the boat so violent that it appeared in danger of upsetting.
Everywhere there was noise like thunder, and the ground was shaking the trees down, and the air was thick with something like smoke. There was much lightning. We believed we must surely die.
Famed naturalist John James Audubon was living in western Kentucky at the time of the quakes.
But at that instant, all the shrubs and trees began to move from their very roots. The ground rose and fell in successive furrows, like the ruffled waters of a lake. And I became bewildered in my ideas as I too plainly discovered that all this awful commotion in nature was the result of an earthquake.
It had to have been a terrifying experience.
These people were frontier types. They weren't highly educated. They knew what earthquakes were and understood earthquakes, but nobody had ever experienced anything like this, so I'm sure everybody was scared to death.
The initial shock, about 7.7 on the Richter scale, struck near the town of New Madrid. In the immediate area, settlers were thrown from their beds as timbers crashed down and chimneys crumbled to dust. Glass exploded and shattered. Barns and fences collapsed as fire consumed many buildings. The Mississippi River was muddied by tons of earth from dislodged banks sliding into her swift currents.
The Mississippi foamed up like the water in a boiling cauldron, and the stream flowed rushing back, while the forest trees near which we lay came crackling and thundering down.
All told, 4 major shocks hit the central United States over a period of several weeks. The initial shock at 2:15 a.m. on December 16th was followed by another large one about 8 that morning. Then on January 23rd, a third large tremor struck as big as the first 2. This was followed by a 4th huge quake on February 7th, probably the largest of the bunch. In between these big shocks, and for months after, the area was shaken by almost constant smaller aftershocks.
An engineer in Kentucky named Jared Brooks set up, after he felt the first earthquake in December of 1811, set up a crude pendulum seismograph. And over a period of 6 months, he recorded about 1,800 earthquakes that were probably large enough to be felt.
So, accounting for the tremors he might have missed, we're talking about well over 2,000 possible earthquakes to rattle the district of New Madrid, beginning on December 16, 1811.
From this time until the 4th of February, the earth was in continual agitation, visibly waving as a gentle sea. And on the 7th, about 4 o'clock a.m., a concussion took place so much more violent than those which had preceded it that it was denominated the hard shock.
The last big one, on February 7th, sliced directly across the Mississippi River, causing a great deal of consternation to river travelers.
These earthquakes were so powerful that they put waterfalls on the Mississippi River, and as you can expect, the Mississippi River here doesn't have waterfalls. There are no rocks.
The whirls and ripplings of the rapids were such that his vessel seemed altogether unmanageable, and destruction seemed inevitable.
At first, the Mississippi seemed to recede from its banks, and its waters gathering up like a mountain, leaving for a moment many boats on the bare sand.
I was awakened by a roaring noise, and if my flatboat load of whiskey had sprung a leak and made the Father of Waters drunk, it could not have committed more somersaults.
What it was basically as the fault itself crossed the river, and what they were noticing was the river itself sloshing. Whenever you have some force of that enormous magnitude happening, to them it did look like it was going backwards, but in essence what it was, the river was sloshing due to the force of the fault rupture.
The fault line created a sharp upthrust, bisecting the river at 3 separate points as it made a northward loop. The southern edge of the fault was shoved up with an offset of as much as 15 feet in places, partially damming the river and causing her to overflow her banks for a brief period of time until the Mississippi resumed her normal course. However, in the wake of this violent upheaval, in the midst of destruction, something incredible was left behind.
Reelfoot Lake did not exist. Prior to the earthquakes, early maps show the Reelfoot area as a river draining into the Mississippi.
Not all of the lake was formed by the quakes, so it wasn't like high dry land suddenly became a lake. It was a low-lying marshy area, old channels, old oxbow lakes, a lot of swamp, a lot of marsh.
At roughly 13,000 acres, Reelfoot Lake is a wealth of natural resources, one of the greatest freshwater fish hatcheries, as well as home to over 250 species of birds, including the magnificent bald eagle.
But out of all that damage did come a lot of beauty. And the beauty of Reelfoot Lake is one of the reminders that we have of the power of nature. Just a great natural area dominated by the large cypress trees, a haven for birds, for fish, and for people.
Other curious effects of the earthquakes, which are still visible today, are known as sand blows.
The surface of hundreds of acres was, from time to time, covered over, of various depths, by the sand which issued from the fissures.
Sand blows occur when a layer of water-saturated sand is topped by a heavier layer of silt or clay. The shaking of the earth forces the sand and water to mix violently.
But they go together and liquefy, and the overburden is pushing down on it and kind of hydraulically charges this. So they're seeking a zone of weakness. You may have a crack open up and the sand and water will shoot out in like a cone or like a little volcano over the top of the overburden.
These dramatic events are caused by a common earthquake phenomenon called liquefaction.
It was the ground motion of the earthquakes that caused the liquefaction process to turn this solid landscape into liquid conditions. Now, sand is made up of little tiny spheres. Now, when the ground starts to shake, those sand grains become more closely packed, and the water between the sand grains is, it's forced out. It has no place to go but up. It can shoot many feet in the air. 1811, 1812, they talk about it shooting as much as, to the tops of high trees.
If there's liquefaction, the ground would fail. Whatever's on that ground would probably break and crack apart. There would be damage to pipelines, water systems, electrical systems, because of that liquefaction potential. And because there's so many unreinforced masonry buildings in the city, I would suspect there'd be substantial damage to them as well.
The earth, as old as she is, maintains her mysteries. However, she does leave behind traces etched deep beneath her crust. Like hieroglyphics, these can be read, studied, her secrets coaxed to the surface by those who understand her language.
Running across the floor here is this host material, but also right here, striking this way, is the sand fissure, and here it goes up the wall, and as it comes out, it rips some of this loose and carries it up with it. That is a real good indication of a sand blow.
What happened in 1811 was not a freak occurrence, a one-time anomaly.
Paleo old liquefaction features that have been dated and show that earthquakes in the last couple thousand years have repeated on average about every 500 years.
The Central U.S. has been shaken by large seismic events throughout history, most notably in the years 500, 900, and 1450. Since the huge sequence 200 years ago, scientists have come to realize that what we have here is a very active system, one which takes its name from the frontier town on the Mississippi, the New Madrid Seismic Zone.
It runs from about 35 miles northwest of Memphis all the way up into southern Illinois. It's made up of 3 separate fault systems. Unlike the western part of the country where we can see the fault, ours is too deeply buried, so it's really a look from what the instruments tell us as to where the fault really lies, but it covers a very large area.
The New Madrid Seismic Zone lies almost in the center of the country, running in a jagged line from Cairo, Illinois to Marktree, Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Memphis. The zone itself encompasses an 8-state region, 8 states and potentially 12 million people who could suffer the consequences of a large quake.
Magnitude 7, 7.5 type event we would expect to impact at least 8 states, dramatically affecting 7 of those states that fall along the Mississippi River. The outlying states of Alabama, Indiana, Illinois, some of those states would see less damage than you would see in the central part of the fault system.
To some, the threat of an earthquake to our heartland may come as a surprise. We're familiar with those which strike the western U.S., which has been shaken many times in the last century. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 caused much damage and a fire that almost destroyed the city. In 1989, a 6.9 struck the San Francisco Bay Area. 63 people died and thousands were left homeless. The 1994 Northridge earthquake had a magnitude of 6.7. It killed 60 and caused $20 billion in damage. So why are earthquakes more common on the West Coast? The Earth's crust is made up of plates that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. The constant shifting of superheated rock inside the Earth generates and stores energy, which presses upward against the boundaries of these tectonic plates, which are known as rifts or faults.
Basically, it's when parts of the Earth crust is moving past another part on a surface usually that we call a fault, and when it slips quickly, it generates seismic waves that are felt by people.
When this slippage occurs, the seams snap like a rubber band, resulting in an earthquake. The western coast of the United States lies along the boundaries of two tectonic plates. Most of the world's earthquake zones center around the seams created by the joining of these plates.
They rub against each other and stick and then break loose in earthquakes. The most famous plate boundary, at least for Americans, is the San Andreas Fault.
However, there are exceptions to every rule, and the New Madrid Seismic Zone is one big rule breaker.
Here in the central United States, we're a long way from any of those plate boundaries, where 98% of the world's earthquakes occur. Our current understanding of the Earth that these plates should be rigid, and you really should only have big earthquakes at the boundaries.
So the central United States is more or less a big flat slab, like a stone tabletop.
We don't really know why we have intraplate seismicity, and we have earthquakes right in the heart of tectonic plates. This is pretty much one of the last unanswered questions for plate tectonics.
And even though there appears to be no good reason for seismic activity in the central U.S.,
we have at least 200 small earthquakes, less than magnitude 4, occur each year. And it seems to be occurring at a constant rate.
You have a large earthquake today in Southern California, it's barely felt 250 miles away in Las Vegas. Whereas it's proposed the large earthquakes that occurred here in the central U.S. 200 years ago were felt 1,200 miles away in Canada.
in the quakes of 1811 and 12, there wasn't much actual damage due to the sparse population in the central U.S. However, the effects were felt all across the country, the tremors even ringing church bells in Charleston.
It rang for a period of about 10 seconds, and people came up to the church and asked, is there a fire? Because the fire watch was in the steeple at the time, and the gentleman replied back, no, it had not. The bell rang by itself.
Scientists believe that the very feature that makes the New Madrid Zone so unusual is responsible for the enormous power of its earthquakes.
The deep geology underneath the Memphis area is mostly large masses of hard, cold rocks that are relatively unbroken. There's some big cracks down there like the Reelfoot Rift, but compared to California, the deep rocks in the crust, and we're talking 10, 15 miles deep here, are really hard and cold. That allows earthquake energy to travel much greater distances in the deep part of the crust, as opposed to places like California, where the deep rocks are relatively hot and shattered. Seismologists and geologists call this attenuation.
The crust in the central U.S. then is thicker, older, more rigid, and it doesn't absorb energy from the seismic waves nearly as much as the crust in the west.
Which means a large earthquake in the New Madrid Zone would be felt over a much wider area than one of the same magnitude centered in California. This expectation drives scientists to constantly delve deeper into the Earth's secrets.
The new Madrid Seismic Zone is the most active seismic zone east of the Rocky Mountains.
Scientists like Dr. Beatrice Magnani, who heads up a team that traverses the Mississippi River projecting powerful sound waves deep into the earth. As these waves bounce back, they're recorded with high-end microphones trailed behind a tugboat. These recordings provide what is essentially an ultrasound picture of that which lies beneath the Earth's crust.
And so by looking then at that subsurface image, we understand where faults are, where deformation occurs, and we can build the history of deformation of a certain area.
This technology allows scientists to create images of the Earth, cracking the secrets of her past. It's almost like looking at a snapshot of history.
What you're seeing here, the real foot thrust, is visible in these three images as a fault that deforms the layers.
If it's true that what's past is indeed prologue, then the New Madrid earthquakes could be dire portents. A major seismic event would be vastly more destructive than 200 years ago. Computer projections indicate that over an 8-state region, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake could result in almost 90,000 injuries and deaths, and over $300 billion in economic losses. A threat which emergency managers are taking very seriously.
We expect to have an awful lot of flooding, a lot of property damage, a lot of buildings down, a lot of people needing shelters, a lot of people needing rescue. It'd be a catastrophic event for Tennessee.
Which means a major interruption of communications and transportation. Urban infrastructure will be severely damaged with widespread power and water outages, as well as ruptured gas lines.
We expect we'll have a number of bridges out, a number of overpasses down. There'll be a lot of fire, and there'll be a lot of fire that burns till the fire goes out. Probably won't be much water pressure. Our conventional way of fighting fire will probably go by the wayside.
A large earthquake in the Central U.S. is considered to be a high-impact, low-probability event, which would be felt not just regionally but globally. But the question remains, how likely is it that the New Madrid Seismic Zone will experience a catastrophic quake in our lifetime?
The probabilities of a repeat of the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811, 1812 is 7 to 10% in the next 50 years. A magnitude 6 and greater, the probabilities are a little larger for a 50-year period, and that's 25 to 40%.
The quakes of 1811 and 12 are now a distant part of our historical record. However, on the afternoon of August 23, 2011, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck the state of Virginia, about 80 miles from Washington, D.C. Many structures were damaged in the nation's capital, and the tremors from this relatively small quake were felt all over the eastern U.S.
It was felt 700 miles away in Chicago. It was felt in Minneapolis. It was felt in Memphis, Tennessee, and Atlanta, hundreds and hundreds of miles away.
That's direct evidence on how well the seismic waves can propagate in the crust in this area.
Which just goes to further the respect and curiosity scientists have for potential earthquakes in the central United States.
At the end of the day, for New Madrid Seismic Zone, we're uncertain about a lot of things. But what we know is that large earthquakes have happened here repeatedly in the past. They were really big, and they could really happen again in the future.
Many questions remain unanswered when it comes to the New Madrid Seismic Zone. But most agree that a large earthquake, when it occurs, will be sudden and it will be disastrous.
Individual preparedness is critically important. I often say that it's a misnomer to speak in terms of first responders coming to your rescue.
Number one, those responders are probably going to be as much of a victim as anyone else is to start with. Number two, the ability to move around, for instance, around town in Memphis, Shelby County, will be very limited.
Because in reality, the first responder is the person right there in the house when the tragedy occurs, whether it's tornado, whether it's flooding, or whether it's an earthquake.
What we expect people to do is try to take care of themselves and take care of their neighbors for the first 36 hours probably. You cannot expect the cavalry to show up in the first day or two.
Being prepared is the key to surviving any disaster. which is why 200 years later, scientists are still studying the New Madrid earthquakes, continuing to uncover the Earth's secrets and trying to solve the mysteries of our broken heartland.
They say it rang the church bells in Charleston far away. The skies were filled with darkness, the land around gave way. Some thought it was the wrath of God come from beneath the hills. They never would forget the days the earth would not stand still. 200 years have come and gone now since those fateful days. A memory near forgotten or just a distant haze. Yet though the man's fault line seems slumbering beneath the hills, just how much time till once again the earth will not stand still?
Funding for this program was made possible in part by the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis, the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. Failure is not an option. The West Tennessee Seismic Safety Commission, the United States Geological Survey, Science for a Changing World, and by viewers like you. Thank you.